The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, glistening under the dim hospital lights. Max hadn't moved from his spot. His fur, once golden and vibrant, was now dull and matted from the relentless storm. His eyes, though tired, never wavered from the hospital doors. Inside, the security room remained silent. The footage had left them speechless. A nurse wiped a tear from her eye. One of the guards exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "How long has he been here?" Someone whispered. "A week," another replied. And still, Max waited. No one had the heart to chase him away. Even the doctors who came and went felt an unspoken respect for the dog's loyalty. Patients in wheelchairs, visitors carrying bouquets of flowers. Each paused for a moment, glancing at the dog before stepping inside, as if recognizing the weight of his silent vigil. Then, late that night, a young woman in scrubs emerged from the hospital. Unlike the others, she didn't rush past. She knelt beside Max, her eyes soft. "Hey, boy," she murmured, offering her hand. Max sniffed her fingers but barely reacted. His focus remained on the doors. The nurse sighed, brushing her hair behind her ear. She had seen his owner before, Daniel Carter. The man had been unconscious when he was wheeled out of the ICU 5 nights ago, and now, as far as anyone knew, he was somewhere inside the rehabilitation ward, a shell of the man he used to be. Her heart ached. Max didn't know that. He was just waiting. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts before pressing a number. "Dr. Lawson?" "That's me. You need to come outside. There's something you need to see." Daniel sat in his hospital bed, staring at the blank TV screen in front of him. His hands were curled into fists on his lap. He barely remembered the past few days. Painkillers. Therapy sessions. Voices speaking in soft tones around him. None of it felt real. What did feel real was the emptiness. The deep, crushing void in his chest. The door creaked open and Dr. Lawson stepped inside. "Daniel," he said gently, "I need to show you something." Daniel didn't move. He barely blinked. Dr. Lawson hesitated, then tried again. "It's about Max." A flicker. A name that once meant something. That once meant everything. Daniel's fingers twitched, his grip loosening slightly. Dr. Lawson held out a tablet and pressed play. The security footage appeared on the screen. The grainy, flickering image of a dog who hadn't moved in. 7 days. Daniel's breath hitched. His vision blurred. His body tensed as he watched Max waiting. Sitting there night after night, never leaving, never looking away from the place he had last seen his owner. A sharp ache spread through Daniel's chest. Not from his injury, but from something deeper. Something he had buried long ago. "He's still out there," Dr. Lawson said quietly. "He's waiting for you." Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to feel. Would Max even recognize him now? Would he even recognize himself? The doctor placed a wheelchair beside the bed. "Come on," he said softly. Daniel hesitated. His hands trembled as he reached for the wheels. Every movement felt foreign, like he was learning how to exist again. But then he looked at the screen once more, at the dog who had never given up on him, and for the first time in weeks Daniel moved. The hospital doors slid open with a soft hiss. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and pavement. Max's ears perked up, his head lifted, his nose twitched as he caught something, a scent he knew better than his own. The wheelchair rolled forward. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might drown out the world. Max stood up slowly, his body tense, his tail hovering between his legs, his deep brown eyes locked onto the man in the chair. The seconds stretched. Max took one step forward, then another. Daniel's throat was dry. His fingers curled into his blanket. "Max," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. Max froze. A flicker of recognition flashed through his eyes. His ears twitched. His tail gave a single uncertain wag. Daniel sucked in a breath. His chest felt like it might shatter under the weight of this moment. Then Max took another step closer. And another. But he didn't run. He didn't jump into Daniel's lap like before. He stopped just a few inches away, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air around him. Daniel slowly, hesitantly, reached out his trembling hand. Max flinched. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He pulled his hand back. His chest ached, not from the injury, but from the way Max was looking at him, not with excitement, not with relief, but with confusion. Max stared at him like he was a stranger, and just like that, the weight of it all came crashing down. Max didn't recognize him. Daniel's fingers curled into his lap, his shoulders slumping. A lump formed in his throat, thick and suffocating. Max's tail was still, his ears slightly lowered. There was no aggression, no fear, just a quiet, unsettling uncertainty. Dr. Lawson placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured. "He's been through a lot, you both have." Daniel swallowed, forcing a nod. But the lump in his throat didn't go away. He had imagined this moment so many times, Max leaping into his arms, his tail wagging wildly, licking his face like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Daniel wasn't the same man Max had known, and Max wasn't the same dog. The silence between them stretched, thick with something unspoken, something broken. Then, without warning, Max took a step back. Daniel's stomach dropped. Another step, then another, and then Max turned away. Daniel barely heard the soft whimper escape his lips before Max walked back to the hospital doors and sat down, waiting, but not for him, not anymore. The night air felt colder than before. Daniel's hands gripped the sides of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. The dog that had once been his lifeline, his family, the one who had spent 7 days waiting, had just turned away. Max sat back down near the hospital entrance, exactly where he had been for the past week, his gaze fixed forward as if nothing had changed, as if Daniel was just another passerby. Dr. Lawson sighed, breaking the heavy silence. This doesn't mean it's over, but to Daniel it felt like it was. The thought lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. He had already lost so much: his career, his strength, his sense of purpose. And now he had just come face to face with the possibility that he had lost Max too. The nurse from earlier stepped forward, kneeling beside the golden retriever. "Max," she called softly, running her fingers through his damp fur. He barely reacted. He wasn't aggressive or afraid, just distant. That was what hurt the most. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing his gaze away. Maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe he shouldn't have come out here. Max was waiting for someone, but it wasn't him. "Let's go," Daniel muttered, wheeling himself back toward the hospital doors. Max didn't even turn his head. Inside the hospital, the overhead lights buzzed softly. The halls smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee from an old vending machine. Daniel sat alone in his room, staring at the window. His reflection looked back at him, a thinner, paler version of the man he used to be, a stranger. The lump in his throat refused to go away. He could still see Max in his mind, sitting there, waiting. But for who? Or worse, for what? A part of him wanted to believe that Max had been waiting for him all along. But that look in his dog's eyes, that hesitation, it was like seeing a memory erased. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, running a hand down his face. It had taken everything in him to wheel himself out there, to face the one thing in his life that had ever truly made sense, and now he felt more lost than ever. Morning came too soon. The first thing Daniel noticed when he woke up was the silence. No sound of paws padding against the floor. No soft breathing curled up at the foot of his bed. No warm weight pressed against his leg. For years Max had been his shadow. Now he was just gone. A nurse entered the room, adjusting the blinds. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Carter?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He swallowed, voice rough. "Is he still out there?" The nurse's face softened. "Yes." "He hasn't moved." Daniel exhaled shakily, staring at the ceiling. What was he supposed to do? Would Max ever remember? Would he ever come back to him? Or was Daniel just another stranger now? Hours passed. Daniel sat in his wheelchair, staring at the hospital doors again. Max was still there, still waiting, still not looking at him. Something inside Daniel twisted. He had faced fire, destruction, life and death. But this hurt worse. He took a deep breath, then another. He had two choices. He could give up, accept that Max no longer saw him as the man he once was, or two. He could fight for him, for their bond, for the years they had spent together, for the love and trust that couldn't just disappear overnight. Daniel knew pain. He knew loss. But he also knew how to fight, and he wasn't about to walk away from Max, not now, not ever. He gritted his teeth and wheeled himself forward. Dr. Lawson met him outside, arms crossed. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel nodded. The doctor studied him for a moment, then exhaled. "All right, but take it slow." Daniel didn't respond. He was already moving. The closer he got, the more his heart pounded. Max's ears twitched. He heard him, but he didn't move. Daniel swallowed, stopping just a few feet away. The tension was suffocating. "Hey, boy," he said softly. Max blinked but didn't react. Daniel reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against something old and worn. He pulled it out. A dog tag. Max's dog tag. He held it up, letting it catch the morning light. "You remember this?" he murmured. Max's ears flicked. His eyes darted to the tag, lingering on it for just a second before looking away again. Daniel's chest tightened. He tried again. Reaching out, he slowly extended his hand, palm up, an old gesture. A familiar one, the one Max had been trained to recognize since he was a puppy. Max's nose twitched. He eyed Daniel's hand cautiously. Then he took a single step forward. Daniel barely breathed. Another step. And then Max lowered his head, sniffing, his fingers. Daniel's throat tightened. "That's it," he whispered. "You know me." Max paused. His body tensed. Daniel could almost see it. The war inside him. Memories buried too deep. Wounds that hadn't fully healed. And then just, as suddenly as he had stepped forward, Max pulled away again. Daniel's stomach dropped, Max's eyes darted away, and he backed up, retreating. A heartbeat later, he turned around and walked away. Not far, just a few steps, just enough to make it clear that he still wasn't sure. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping his wheelchair's armrests. Wasn't rejection. Not entirely. It was hesitation, and hesitation meant hope. Dr. Lawson spoke from behind him. "It's not going to happen overnight." Daniel swallowed. He already knew that, but at least now he knew one thing for sure. Max was still in there, somewhere, and if there was even a chance of getting him back, Daniel was willing to fight for. No matter how long it took, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and distant chimney smoke. Daniel sat in his wheelchair just outside the hospital doors, staring at Max, who sat a few feet away, his back turned. It had been 3 days since their first interaction. 3 days of slow, painful progress. 3 days of small steps forward. Only for Max to retreat again. The dog wasn't hostile, he wasn't afraid. But he wasn't coming back either, and that uncertainty was its own kind of heartbreak. Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. "You don't make this easy, do you, buddy?" he muttered under his breath. Max's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he didn't turn around. Daniel had spent hours watching him, the way his tail would lift slightly when he saw a familiar nurse, the way his ears perked when a car door slammed, like he was listening for something, and the way his eyes always lingered on the hospital doors, scanning every person who stepped outside, still waiting, still not sure who he was waiting for. Dr. Lawson stood beside Daniel, hands in his coat pockets. "I know the fact that he even came near you at all is a good sign." Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah? Tell that to my pride." The doctor smirked. "Trust takes time." Daniel clenched his jaw. Time. He had already lost so much of it, but if time was what Max needed, then he'd give him all the time in the world. That afternoon, Daniel made his first real attempt. With the hospital's approval, he was allowed to take short walks outside in his wheelchair. Just around the front courtyard. Nothing too far. Max didn't follow, but he didn't leave either. Daniel took it slow. He would wheel himself closer, just a foot or two, then stop. He never reached for Max, never pushed too hard. He just sat there, letting Max get used to him again. At first, Max barely acknowledged him, but on the second day, Daniel noticed something. Max didn't sit with his back turned anymore. He still wasn't close, but he was watching, and that was something. On the fourth day, Daniel tried something different. He wheeled himself over to the hospital bench, setting a small paper bag beside him. Max stayed where he was, watching cautiously. Daniel didn't speak right away. He reached into the bag and pulled out a sandwich, then a small piece of chicken. Max's nose twitched, his ears perked. The golden retriever sat up a little straighter, his tail flicking once against the pavement. Daniel placed the chicken on the ground, a few feet away, then leaned back. He didn't call Max over, didn't try to bribe him with words, just let the food sit there. Max hesitated. His eyes darted between Daniel and the small piece of chicken. Then, slowly, cautiously, he stood up. Daniel's breath caught as Max took his first step forward, then another and another. The dog sniffed the air, stepping closer to the food, his gaze flickering to Daniel every few seconds. Finally, he lowered his head and grabbed the piece of chicken, chewing slowly. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. This was the closest Max had been to him in weeks. For a brief, fleeting moment, Daniel saw it, the dog he had once known. But as soon as the food was gone, Max stepped back. Again, not as far as before, but still back. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to be patient. "Good boy," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Max didn't wag his tail, but he also didn't leave, and Daniel would take that as a win. On the fifth day, something unexpected happened. Daniel had just finished another short walk around the courtyard when a sharp, distant clap of thunder rumbled in the sky. Almost instantly, Max's body tensed, his ears pinned back. His muscles locked up. Daniel recognized the signs immediately. Fear. Max had never been afraid of storms before. But now his breathing quickened, his tail tucked slightly between his legs. Daniel felt his heart squeeze in his chest. Had something happened while they were apart? Slowly he wheeled himself forward. "Hey," he murmured. "It's just thunder, buddy." Max didn't look at him, didn't move. Another boom shook the sky, and Max flinched. Daniel hated this. Hated seeing Max react like this. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a whistle. Not just any whistle, their whistle. A sharp, two-note command they had used for years. Daniel lifted it to his lips and blew softly. The first note was steady. The second was familiar. Max's ears twitched, his body stilled, his head turned toward Daniel. For the first time Max really looked at him. Daniel's throat tightened. "That's right," he whispered. "You remember, don't you?" Max stared at him, eyes locked. And for a moment, a small, fragile moment, Daniel saw it. Not confusion, not hesitation, but recognition, a memory, something deep inside. Max's mind stirred. The dog took a single step forward, then another. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the recognition faded. Max blinked, shook his head, and backed away again. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay patient. But it was so damn hard. He felt so close, so unbearably close. Dr. Lawson's voice echoed in his mind. "It's not going to happen overnight." Daniel swallowed. He knew that. He did. But knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. That night, Daniel sat in his hospital room, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the whistle, the way Max had reacted, the way he had looked at him, just for a second. It was there, the memory, the bond, buried deep but not gone. And as long as there was even a sliver of hope, Daniel would not give up. Not now. Not ever. Because Max had waited for him. And now, it was Daniel's turn to wait for Max. The morning air carried a soft chill, and the clouds stretched thick and grey across the sky. Daniel sat outside the hospital in his wheelchair, watching Max from a distance. The golden retriever was curled up near the entrance, his head resting on his paws. It had been over a week now, a week of slow progress, of hesitation, of almosts. Max. would take small steps forward, only to retreat again. He would sniff the air near Daniel's hand but wouldn't lean in. He would sit closer than before, but never too close. It was like watching a fragile thread being pulled tighter and tighter, ready to snap at the slightest movement. Daniel wanted to be patient, but the waiting, the not knowing, was eating him alive. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Today, he was going to try one last thing. By mid-afternoon, Daniel had a plan. With the help of the hospital staff, he was cleared to leave for a few hours, and he knew exactly where he was going. The park, their park, the place where he and Max had spent years, together, before everything changed, before the accident, before the separation, before Max forgot him. A part of Daniel was terrified. What if this didn't work? What if nothing worked, but he had to try? For Max, for them. The car ride was eerily silent. Max lay in the back seat, curled up on a blanket, his body still. He wasn't tense, but he wasn't relaxed either. He simply stared out the window, watching the world pass by. Daniel sat in the front, gripping the edges of his armrests, forcing himself to breathe. It had been so long since they had last been here. And now they were going back as strangers. When they arrived, the park was quiet. The sky was still overcast, the wind gentle. The grass was damp from last night's rain. The old wooden bench, their bench, was still there, sitting beneath the large oak tree. Daniel wheeled himself to the bench and stopped. He glanced over his shoulder. Max had jumped out of the car, but he wasn't running ahead like he used to. He was standing still, watching, waiting. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out an old rubber ball. It was worn, the edges frayed from years of play, Max's favorite toy. Daniel didn't say a word. He simply held it up, let Max see it, then tossed it gently across the grass. The ball bounced once, then rolled to a stop a few feet away. Max's ears twitched, his gaze locked onto it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For a few seconds, Max didn't move. Then he took a step forward, then another, then another. Slowly he approached the ball. Daniel's fingers tightened against his lap. He was afraid to blink. Max sniffed the ball, his nose pressing against the worn fabric. His body stiffened, his tail flicked, just slightly. Daniel barely breathed. Then Max lifted his head. His eyes met Daniel's, and for the first time in weeks, something changed. There was no more hesitation, no more confusion. For the first time since their reunion, Max recognized him. A soft whimper broke from the dog's throat. His ears perked, his tail twitched again. He took a step forward, then another, faster this time. Then, in a blur of golden fur, Max ran, straight to Daniel, straight to him. Daniel barely had time to react before Max leaped, his front paws landing against Daniel's lap. His tail wagged wildly, his nose pressing against Daniel's chest, sniffing, nudging, searching. Daniel gasped, his hands trembling as he reached up, running his fingers through Max's fur. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. His voice cracked. Max let out a choked, broken whimper. Then he buried his head into Daniel's chest, and Daniel broke. Tears slipped down his face as he clutched Max close, his fingers gripping onto him as if he might disappear again. But Max wasn't letting go. He whined, pressing closer, his body trembling with the weight of remembering, of coming home. Daniel whispered every nickname he could think of. Good boy. Maxie. Partner. Buddy, and with every word, Max wagged his tail harder, licked Daniel's cheek, pressed his nose to his neck, like he was making sure Daniel was real, like he was making sure Daniel wasn't leaving again. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Daniel didn't care. He had Max back. And Max. He had finally found what he had been waiting for. As the sun began to set, Max curled up beside Daniel's wheelchair, his head resting against his leg, his eyes half closed. Daniel ran his fingers through Max's fur, exhaling softly. He had almost given up, almost walked away. But Max had been in there all along, and now they had both found their way back. Together. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow across the park. The air smelled of damp grass and autumn leaves. Daniel sat in his wheelchair, one hand resting on Max's back as the golden retriever lay beside him, his body pressed close, his breathing slow and steady. It had been hours since the breakthrough, since Max had finally remembered, but Daniel still wasn't ready to move. Neither was Max. For the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation, no distance between them, just warmth. Just trust, just them. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers running absent-mindedly through Max's fur. The dog let out a quiet sigh, shifting to rest his head on Daniel's knee. "You really made me work for that one, didn't you, buddy?" Daniel murmured with a soft chuckle. Max huffed in response, his tail thumping lightly against the ground. Daniel smiled, shaking his head. Yeah, I get it. You had to make sure I was worth it." Max nudged his knee with his nose. It was such a small thing. But after everything, it was everything. The drive home was quiet, peaceful. Max curled up in the back seat, his head resting on a blanket, his eyes flickering between sleep and wakefulness. Daniel, sitting in the front, watched him through the rearview mirror. His throat tightened. For weeks he had imagined this moment, and now it was real. It felt like a second chance, like a homecoming. When they arrived, Daniel hesitated. He rolled his wheelchair up to the front door, swallowing thickly. It had been so long since Max had stepped inside this house. Would he remember? Would he feel safe? Daniel reached for the door handle, glancing over his shoulder. "You ready, bud?" Max didn't hesitate. He trotted forward, tail wagging, ears up. As soon as the door swung open, Max stepped inside, not cautiously, not hesitantly, like he belonged, like he knew. Daniel's chest ached. Max sniffed the air, padding further in. His tail swayed lightly. As he walked straight to the living room, straight to his old spot, the corner where his bed used to be, Daniel swallowed hard. "Wait here, boy." He wheeled himself toward the hallway closet, digging through old blankets, boxes, and forgotten things until he found what he was looking for. Max's old dog bed. It was worn, covered in faint hairs from a time when things were easier. Daniel dragged it out, unfolding it near the fireplace. He hesitated, then reached into another box, pulling out an old stuffed toy, Max's favorite. He rolled back to the living room, setting both down. Max sniffed the air, ears perking. Daniel braced himself. Would Max remember? Would he even care? For a long moment, Max just stared. Then he moved, not cautiously, not hesitantly, with purpose. He walked straight to the bed, turned twice in a circle, then lay down with a heavy sigh. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Reached forward, setting the stuffed toy beside him. Max sniffed it. Then with the softest movement he tucked it beneath his chin. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing down the emotion, threatening to spill over. Instead, he reached down, ran his fingers gently through Max's fur, and for the first time since coming home, Max looked up at him, not with hesitation, not with confusion, but with complete trust, with love. And Daniel knew this wasn't just a house anymore. It was home. That night, Daniel left his bedroom door open. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. He had almost lost this, almost walked away. But love, real love, wasn't something you gave up on. It was something you fought for. A soft sound echoed from the hallway. The gentle pad of paws against the wooden floor. Daniel didn't move, didn't say a word. A moment later, Max appeared in the doorway. For a second, he just stood there. Then, slowly, carefully, he stepped. Inside, Daniel's chest ached. He didn't call for Max, didn't ask him to come closer. Instead, he just whispered, "Good boy." Max hesitated only for a second. Then, with a heavy sigh, he lay down right beside the bed, his body curled up, his breathing steady, his presence unshakable. And as Daniel drifted to sleep, for the first time in months, he wasn't alone. He had Max, and Max had him. Some bonds can never be broken. Not by time, not by distance, not even by memory. Have you ever experienced an unbreakable connection with an animal? A love that never faded no matter how much life changed? Tell us your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes the best stories, the ones that truly matter, aren't just about love. They're about finding your way back to it.